The birthday cake sat in the center of my dining room table with 70 candles burning like a small forest fire, and my daughter Jessica was using their light to show a stranger the crown molding Richard had installed the year before his heart attack. "Original craftsman detail," she was saying, running her finger along the wood with an intimacy that made my stomach turn, because this was my house, not hers, and she was giving a tour to someone I'd met exactly 12 minutes ago. Mark adjusted his blazer and nodded, pulling out his phone to take photos of my ceiling, my walls, my life. Jessica had introduced him as a friend who does real estate appraisals, just getting a head start on valuating things for when you're gone, Mom. The casual cruelty of that phrase, "when you're gone," hung in the air like smoke from the candles everyone was waiting for me to blow out. I smiled and cut the cake while my daughter discussed my home's future with a man who'd brought business cards to my birthday party. If you've ever felt invisible in your own house, subscribe and tell me what state you're in, because what I did next proved that being 70 doesn't mean being powerless. Mark excused himself to use the bathroom, which gave me exactly 90 seconds to make a decision that would change everything. I followed him into the hallway, my pulse hammering in my ears, and when he emerged, I was waiting by the photos of Richard that lined the wall leading to the kitchen. "Mark, right?" I asked, keeping my voice low enough that Jessica couldn't hear from the dining room where she was serving cake. He nodded, clearly uncomfortable being cornered by the birthday woman herself. "I heard what my daughter said about the appraisal," I continued, watching his face for tells. His eyes darted toward the dining room, then back to me. "Want to skip the waiting and buy the house yourself? I'm motivated. Closing in 30 days. I'll take $830,000, which is $50,000 under the market appraisal Jessica probably already told you about." The number hung between us like a dare. Mark's expression shifted from confusion to calculation in the space of a heartbeat, and I knew I had him. His hand went to his inside jacket pocket, pulling out one of those business cards that had offended me so deeply 20 minutes earlier. "You're serious," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. I took the card, studied the embossed lettering, and nodded once. "Dead serious. My daughter seems to think this house is already hers. I'd like to correct that assumption before dessert is finished." Mark's laugh was nervous but genuine, and he glanced back toward the dining room where Jessica was holding court, probably discussing staging strategies or which walls she'd knock down once she inherited. "I'd need to see the full property, get my financing in order, maybe bring my wife to look at it," he started, but I cut him off with a raised hand. "You've already been photographing my crown molding for 10 minutes. You know the neighborhood, you know the bones of the house, and unless I'm very wrong about what you do for a living, you've already run the comparables in your head." His silence was confirmation enough. "Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., bring your wife and your mortgage guy." "But Mark?" I waited until he met my eyes. "Don't mention this to Jessica tonight." The rest of the party crawled by with excruciating slowness, every conversation feeling like performance art as I accepted birthday wishes from people who had no idea what I'd just set in motion. Jessica brought me a piece of my own cake on my mother's good china, the china that would be sold with the house, along with everything else I didn't pack in the next 4 weeks, and sat beside me with the kind of artificial cheer that made my teeth ache. "Mom, I know having Mark here might seem weird, but I promise it's just practical planning. Estate stuff is so complicated, and I'm just trying to make things easier for you." The lies came so smoothly, I wondered how long she'd been practicing them. I took a bite of cake that tasted like cardboard in my suddenly dry mouth and smiled at my only child, the daughter I'd raised in this house, whose bedroom furniture I'd painted 3 times to match her changing taste. "That's very thoughtful, Jessica," I managed, and watched her relax because she thought I'd accepted her story. Mark caught my eye across the room and gave the tiniest nod before making his excuses and leaving with promises to Jessica that he'd be in touch about next steps. Neither of us corrected her assumption about what those next steps would be. That night, after everyone left and the house fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the settling sounds that Richard used to say were the building talking to itself, I sat at the kitchen table with the deed to my house spread in front of me like a treasure map. Richard's signature was still visible on the transfer documents from 1986, when we'd scraped together the down payment by selling his truck and my grandmother's jewelry. 40 years of mortgage payments, of painting and repairs, of raising Jessica in these rooms that held every major memory of my adult life. The house was worth $880,000 in the current market, and I was selling it for $830,000. That $50,000 discount was buying me something money couldn't usually purchase. Revenge served at room temperature on my own birthday. Jessica had brought an appraiser to my party. I'd sold the house to him before she'd finished her second piece of cake. The symmetry was almost beautiful. I took photos of every page of the deed, backed them up to the cloud account Jessica didn't know I had, and texted Mark, 9 a.m. works. Come hungry? I'll have coffee ready. Morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that made everything seem possible, and I'd already been awake for 3 hours preparing when Mark's silver Lexus pulled into my driveway at 8:57. He emerged with a woman I assumed was his wife, petite, professionally dressed, carrying a leather portfolio that screamed serious buyer, and a man in his 60s wearing the slightly rumpled look of someone who'd closed 1,000 mortgages and couldn't be bothered with pretense anymore. I opened the door before they could ring the bell, gestured them into the living room where I'd set up coffee and the banana bread Jessica had always loved but would never eat in this house again. I'm Patricia, I said, shaking hands with Mark's wife Elena and the mortgage specialist, whose name turned out to be Doug. Thank you for coming on such short notice. I know this is unusual. Elena's handshake was firm, her eyes already cataloging the built-in bookshelves and the original hardwood floors that Richard had refinished twice over the decades. Doug pulled out a tablet and started taking notes, while Mark stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, clearly uncertain how to navigate the strangeness of appraising a house his client's daughter thought she'd inherit. Why the urgency? Elena asked, direct in a way I appreciated. And why $50,000 under market? I poured coffee into mugs that had been wedding gifts and met her eyes. Because my daughter brought your husband to my birthday party to value my estate before I'm dead. And I'd rather sell at a loss than watch her spend the next however many years wishing I'd hurry up and die so she can knock down walls and pick new furniture. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Doug clearing his throat and typing something on his tablet. Elena's expression softened into something like understanding, and she accepted the coffee with a nod that felt like solidarity. Let's see the rest of the house, she said. The tour took 45 minutes, with Elena asking questions about updated electrical and Doug photographing the furnace installation date while Mark trailed behind, looking increasingly uncomfortable about the whole situation. I showed them everything. The master bedroom where Richard had died in his sleep 3 years ago, still peaceful despite my grief. Jessica's old room that I'd converted to a sewing space she'd mocked as pointless the last time she visited. The basement where Richard's workshop remained exactly as he'd left it, tools hung on pegboard in order of size. Elena ran her hand along the granite countertops in the kitchen, examined the new appliances I'd installed just 18 months ago, and asked about property taxes and HOA fees with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she was looking at. The house is solid, she finally said, looking at Mark and Doug rather than me. Better than solid, it's been maintained beautifully. The roof is 7 years old, windows replaced in 2020, HVAC updated last year. At $830,000, we're getting a steal even with closing costs and immediate possession. Doug nodded, fingers flying across his tablet. We can close in 30 days if financing comes through clean, which it will. Mark and Elena's credit is excellent. They're pre-approved for up to $950, and they've been looking in this neighborhood for 6 months. He looked at me over his reading glasses. But I have to ask, Patricia, does your daughter know you're selling? The answer mattered, legally and morally, and I'd prepared for the question. This house is in my name alone, has been since my husband died. Jessica has no legal claim to it, no financial interest, and no say in what I do with my own property. She has opinions about what should happen after I die, which is why I'm making sure it happens before. Doug smiled, just slightly, and typed something else. Good enough for me. Mark, Elena, you want this house? They looked at each other, one of those married couple conversations that happens entirely in glances and micro-expressions. And then Elena turned to me with her hand extended. Yes, we do. Let's write an offer. The paperwork started that afternoon at Doug's office, a modest suite in a strip mall that smelled like burnt coffee and photocopier toner. Mark and Elena sat across from me, signing document after document, while Doug orchestrated the process with the bored efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. Purchase agreement at full asking price, $830,000. Inspection waiver. Elena's brother was apparently a contractor and would do a walkthrough as a favor, but they were buying as is. 30-day closing with my guarantee that the house would be empty and broom clean. Earnest money deposit of $20,000 wired immediately from their account to the title company's escrow. My hands shook slightly as I signed my name again and again. Patricia Morrison in flowing script that Richard had always said looked like calligraphy. "You're really doing this," Mark said at one point, watching me initial a disclosure form. "I'm really doing this," I confirmed, and didn't add that every signature felt like freedom, like finally moving forward instead of waiting to die so my daughter could remodel. Doug passed me another form, this one about property tax prorations and homeowners insurance, and I signed it without reading because I'd already decided to trust these strangers more than my own child. The irony wasn't lost on me. "One thing," Elena said as we neared the end of the stack. "When are you telling Jessica?" The question I'd been avoiding crystallized into something unavoidable. "When she calls wondering why there's a sold sign in the yard," I answered, and the truth of it sat heavy in the room. I know that makes me sound cruel, but she brought a realtor to my birthday party to appraise my house before I'm dead. That's crueler. Nobody argued with my logic. We finished the paperwork in silence, punctuated only by the scratch of pens and Doug's occasional instructions to initial here, sign there, date everything. By 4 p.m., I'd sold my house of 40 years to people I'd met that morning, and the strange thing was how right it felt. Jessica called 3 days later, her voice bright with false cheer that I'd learned to recognize as her attempting manipulation. "Mom, hi. I've been thinking about Mark's visit, and I wanted to apologize if that was awkward. I know it's morbid to plan ahead like that, but I promise I'm just trying to be responsible about estate stuff." She paused, waiting for me to reassure her, to tell her it was fine, to absolve her of the casual cruelty of appraising my life while I was still living it. Instead, I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, counting slowly to 10 in my head the way Richard used to when he was angry and needed to avoid saying something regrettable. "Mom, you there?" Jessica's voice had shifted from bright to concerned, probably wondering if I'd had a stroke or simply wandered away from the phone. "I'm here," I finally said, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. "Jessica, I need to tell you something. I've sold the house." The silence on her end was absolute, profound, the kind of quiet that precedes storms. I could hear her breathing, could picture her face transitioning from confusion to shock to anger. "You what?" The words came out strangled, barely audible. "I sold the house. To Mark, actually. He and his wife made an offer I accepted. We close in 27 days. More silence, and then an explosion. "You can't do that. That's my inheritance. That house is supposed to be mine." The mask had fallen completely, revealing what I'd suspected all along. She'd already decided the house belonged to her, had made plans for its future that didn't include the inconvenient detail of me still living in it. "The house is mine, Jessica. Will be until closing day, when it becomes Mark and Elena's. Your inheritance is whatever I choose to give you, which at this moment is looking like the china cabinet in the guest room and maybe the photo albums if you ask nicely." I could hear her crying now, angry tears that I refused to feel guilty about. "I have to go pack," I told her, and ended the call before she could respond. My hands were shaking, but I felt lighter than I had in years. The symbolic weight of the house key had never been more apparent than in the following weeks, as I sorted through 4 decades of accumulated life and decided what came with me versus what stayed with the walls. I'd worn the key on a chain around my neck since Richard died, a superstitious habit I'd developed to feel close to him. And now I had to accept that soon it would open someone else's door. Mark and Elena stopped by twice more, once with a contractor who confirmed the foundation was sound, and again with their teenage daughter who would apparently take Jessica's old room and probably fill it with better memories. Each visit made the transition more real, more inevitable, and more necessary. I'd found an apartment in a 55-plus community near the lake, a 2-bedroom with a balcony and a view that Richard would have loved. The rent was a third of what my property taxes had been, and I'd have enough from the sale to live comfortably for the rest of my life, even if I lived to be 100. Jessica called 6 more times in those weeks, leaving voicemails that progressed from anger to bargaining to what sounded like genuine grief. "Mom, please, we can talk about this. Don't sell the house out of spite. It's our family home." But she was wrong. It had been Richard's and my home, and we'd raised her here out of love, not to create an obligation that she could cash in when we were gone. The movers came on day 28, loading a U-Haul with the furniture and boxes I'd marked keeper, leaving behind the pieces that belonged to the house's bones more than to me. The antique dining table stayed, as did the bedroom set in Jessica's old room and the workbench in Richard's basement shop. Let Mark and Elena build new memories around old foundations. I kept only what I needed: photos, Richard's wedding ring, my mother's recipe box, and the clothes that still fit after 70 years of living. Everything else was just stuff, and I was tired of being weighed down by stuff. Closing day arrived with unexpected sunshine, the kind of perfect weather that feels like cosmic approval. I met Mark, Elena, and Doug at the title company office, a bland corporate space with motivational posters and artificial plants that couldn't have been more different from the lived-in warmth of the house we were transferring. The title officer was a cheerful woman named Sandra who guided us through the final signatures with practiced ease, explaining each document's purpose in a voice that suggested she'd given this speech 1,000 times. Mark and Elena signed mortgage documents while I signed the deed transfer, the gesture feeling both momentous and strangely anticlimactic. "This is the part where I say congratulations," Sandra announced when the last paper was signed, "and remind everyone that the property officially changes hands at midnight tonight." She handed Elena a folder containing all their copies and turned to me with a sealed envelope. "Your proceeds check, Patricia. $830,000, minus closing costs and prorations. Final amount is $814,312. The number was staggering, representing everything Richard and I had built together, converted into liquid assets that I could use however I wanted. Mark cleared his throat awkwardly. "Patricia, I want you to know, Elena and I, we'll take good care of the house. We're not going to gut it or anything. Some updating, sure, but we love the character." I believed him, surprisingly. "Just love it," I said, pulling the house key off the chain around my neck where it had lived for 3 years. "That's all any house needs." I pressed the key into Elena's palm and walked out of the title company into sunshine that felt like a new beginning. Jessica appeared at my new apartment 2 weeks later, having finally extracted the address from my sister, who I'd sworn to secrecy, but who apparently cracked under 20 minutes of pleading phone calls. My daughter stood in the hallway, looking diminished somehow, smaller than the person who'd brought a realtor to my birthday party. And I almost felt sorry for her until I remembered the casual cruelty of "when you're gone." "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice stripped of its usual confidence. I let her in, gestured to the second-hand couch I'd bought because my old furniture had been too large for this space, and waited. The apartment was half the size of the house, filled with only essentials and the things that mattered most, and in the 3 weeks I'd lived here, I'd started to feel something I hadn't experienced in years: freedom. Jessica sat perched on the edge of the couch like she might need to run, her hands twisting in her lap in a nervous gesture I remembered from her childhood. "Mom, I'm sorry. I know bringing Mark to your party was wrong. I know talking about the house like you were already dead was horrible. She stopped, clearly struggling for words that would make this better. "I just got caught up in planning, in thinking about the future, and I forgot you're still living your life. I'm sorry." The apology felt genuine, or at least more genuine than anything she'd said in months, but it didn't change what she'd revealed about herself. "You brought a realtor to my 70th birthday to appraise my house," I said quietly. "You discussed my death like it was a project timeline. You made plans for my home while I was standing right there eating cake. That's not something you do when you forget someone's still alive. That's something you do when you're waiting for them to die." Jessica flinched, and I felt a twinge of guilt that I ruthlessly suppressed, because truth was truth, even when it hurt. "I know," she whispered. "I know, and I don't have a good excuse except that I'm 38 and broke and scared, and I saw that house as my security. But that doesn't make it right. I'm sorry, Mom. Really, truly sorry." We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us like humidity before a storm. "I'm not giving you the money from the sale," I finally told her. "That's going into investments that'll keep me comfortable for however long I have left. But I'm not cutting you out of my life either, if you don't want that." Jessica looked up, tears streaming down her face that might have been manipulative, except I'd known her long enough to recognize real crying versus performance. "I don't want that," she said. "I want my mom back. I want to be better than the person who valued your house more than your life." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The B story that had been running parallel to my real estate drama involved my neighbor from the old house, Mrs. Chen, who'd lived 3 doors down for 20 years and had become something closer to family than friend after Richard died. She'd been horrified when I told her about Jessica's birthday stunt, had offered to testify in court, if it came to that. Elder abuse, she'd called it, which felt both dramatic and accurate. Mrs. Chen had helped me pack, had taken boxes of books and kitchen items I couldn't fit in the apartment, and had stood in my empty living room on moving day and cried harder than I did. But her real contribution to my story came in the form of her grandson Marcus, a 24-year-old law student who'd been researching elder financial exploitation for his thesis. Marcus had spent hours explaining to me exactly what Jessica had been attempting, even if she didn't realize it herself, creating a narrative of anticipated inheritance that could have led to undue influence, conservatorship petitions, or worse if I'd been even slightly more vulnerable. "What you did, selling the house, that was brilliant," Marcus told me over coffee at the new apartment. "You removed the asset from play before it could become a source of conflict or legal manipulation. Your daughter can't contest a sale that's already closed, and she has no grounds to claim undue influence because you were the one initiating the transaction." He'd brought me copies of his research, highlighted sections about financial abuse of elderly parents by adult children. And though I couldn't bring myself to read most of it, too close to my own experience, I was grateful for the validation that I hadn't overreacted. Mrs. Chen visited monthly now, bringing homemade dumplings and gossip about the old neighborhood. And through her, I learned that Mark and Elena had painted Jessica's old room a soft yellow and installed a window seat. "It looks beautiful," Mrs. Chen reported. "They're good people. You chose well." I had chosen well, in the strange way that sometimes spite leads to better outcomes than careful planning. The epilogue of my story unfolded over the following months, in ways both surprising and inevitable, as Jessica and I rebuilt something that looked different from our old relationship, but might eventually be stronger for having broken and been repaired. She started visiting regularly, bringing takeout and asking about my life in the apartment complex, where I joined a book club and started taking watercolor classes. We didn't talk about the house much, though she mentioned once that she'd driven by and seen Mark and Elena's daughter playing in the yard where Jessica used to have a swing set. "It hurt," she admitted, "seeing someone else living my childhood, but I also realized I'd been treating your house like a museum of my past instead of your present. That wasn't fair." We were learning to be mother and daughter in a context where I didn't own property she could someday inherit, where our relationship had to be based on affection rather than anticipated assets. It was harder than it should have been, but also cleaner somehow. The money from the sale sat in a diversified portfolio that my financial advisor promised would generate enough income to keep me comfortable for decades, plus a cushion for emergencies or the eventual nursing home I'd probably need if I lived long enough. I'd set aside $10,000 for Jessica in my will, not nothing, but not the windfall she'd been expecting either. The bulk of my estate would go to scholarships in Richard's name at the community college where he'd taught woodworking for 30 years before retirement. Let his legacy be education and craftsmanship, not a daughter's remodeling budget. The house key I'd worn around my neck for 3 years had been replaced by a smaller key, the one to my apartment, and I wore it on the same chain as a reminder that home was wherever I decided to make it. Richard would have understood, would have supported the sale, even though it meant letting go of the house he'd poured so much love and labor into. He'd always valued freedom over possession, had taught me that things owned you if you weren't careful, and I'd finally learned that lesson at 70. My new apartment had a balcony where I could watch the sunrise over the lake, And most mornings I sat there with coffee in one of the mugs that had survived the move, thinking about the strange path that had led me here. Jessica's appraisal stunt, Mark's opportunistic purchase, my own willingness to sell at a loss rather than let my daughter count days until inheritance. All of it had conspired to give me something I hadn't known I needed. Proof that I was still the author of my own story. The ending wasn't written yet, but at least now I was holding the pen instead of watching someone else draft my final chapters. If you've made it this far into my story, subscribe to hear more about families who forgot that elderly parents are still people with agency and choices. Comment below with your city or state. I'd love to know where you're watching from and if you've ever had to reclaim your life from people who'd already planned your exit. The financial practicalities of my decision revealed themselves slowly, in spreadsheets and statements that proved I'd made the right choice even if it had felt reckless in the moment. $814,000 after taxes and investments generated enough monthly income that I could have lived on interest alone if I'd been willing to be frugal. But I wasn't interested in frugality anymore. I was 70 years old, widowed, and increasingly aware that someday was a luxury I couldn't afford to assume. I traveled for the first time in a decade, booking a river cruise through Europe that Richard and I had always planned but never taken because there was always some reason to delay. The Danube was beautiful in spring, and I stood on the deck watching castles slide past while thinking about the house I'd sold and feeling nothing but relief. Jessica video called me from the ship, asking about the trip with what seemed like genuine interest rather than the performance of interest I'd grown used to. "You look happy, Mom," she said, and I realized I was. Happiness had become so unfamiliar, I'd almost forgotten to recognize it. "I am happy," I told her. "I'm finally living instead of waiting to die so you can redecorate." The words came out harsher than I'd intended, and I saw her flinch on the screen. "I deserved that," she said quietly. We were learning honesty in our relationship, painful as it sometimes was. I sent her postcards from Vienna and Budapest and Prague, not trying to make her jealous, but wanting her to see that selling the house had given me life rather than taking it away. She kept them all, she told me later, pinned to the bulletin board in her kitchen as reminder that parents were people too. The symbolic journey of the house deed reached its final form 6 months after closing, when I received a letter from Mark and Elena with photos of renovations they'd completed. They'd updated the kitchen cabinets, but kept your husband's original tile work, Elena noted, and converted Richard's workshop into a home gym while preserving his pegboard tool organization system behind glass as a tribute to the craftsmen who came before. The gesture moved me more than I'd expected, this acknowledgement that the house had history worth preserving even as it moved forward into new purposes. They'd planted a Japanese maple in the front yard and invited me to visit any time I wanted, an offer I hadn't taken them up on but appreciated having. Letting go of the house meant letting go of the need to control what happened to it next, trusting that new owners would love it in their own way. The deed copy I'd kept, photographed and backed up to my cloud account, sat in a folder marked Closed Chapters, along with Richard's death certificate and Jessica's childhood report cards. Some things were meant to be archived rather than displayed, remembered rather than relived. I'd given up trying to make peace with what Jessica had done at my birthday party, had accepted that some betrayals left permanent marks even after apologies were offered, and partially accepted. But I'd also learned that permanent marks didn't have to mean permanent damage, that you could acknowledge hurt without letting it define every subsequent interaction. Jessica and I were building something new on the foundation of what had broken, and if it never reached the closeness we'd had before, maybe that was okay too. Some relationships improved by becoming more honest, even if less comfortable. The watercolor class I joined at the community center became an unexpected source of joy and frustration in equal measure. As I discovered, I had absolutely no talent for painting, but tremendous pleasure in trying anyway. My instructor, a patient woman named Claire, who'd retired from art teaching at the local high school, kept encouraging me to find my own style, when what I'd really found was an ability to make everything look slightly melted. I painted the old house from memory, creating a muddy mess of browns and greens that looked nothing like Richard's careful craftsmanship, and I loved it anyway because it was mine. Jessica came to the community center's student art show, stood in front of my painting and laughed, not cruelly, but with genuine amusement that I found myself sharing. "Mom, what is that supposed to be?" she asked, squinting at the canvas. "Our old house," I admitted. "I know it looks like a drunk person's fever dream, but I enjoyed making it." Jessica smiled, really smiled, and linked her arm through mine. "It's perfect. Can I buy it?" I sold her my terrible watercolor for $50, a fraction of what I'd taken off the house's sale price, and the symmetry felt complete somehow. She hung it in her living room, she told me later, as a reminder that not everything worth keeping had to be perfect or valuable. Some things mattered simply because they were made with love, even if that love produced questionable art. The year mark of the sale passed with less fanfare than I'd anticipated, noted more by the calendar than by any emotional milestone. I'd been living in my apartment for 11 months, had settled into routines that felt sustainable and satisfying, and had stopped thinking of the old house as mine in any possessive sense. Mark and Elena sent a Christmas card with a photo of their family in front of the house, and I displayed it on my refrigerator alongside Jessica's graduation picture and my own wedding photo. The house looked good in the background, lived in and loved, which was all I'd wanted. Jessica hosted Thanksgiving at her place that year, a cramped apartment that couldn't fit everyone comfortably, but felt warmer than the formal dinners we'd had in the old house. I brought my mother's recipe for sweet potato casserole and watched my daughter navigate hosting with the same nervous perfectionism I remembered from her childhood. "You're doing great," I told her at one point, and meant it. She'd grown this year, had learned some lessons the hard way, and I was trying to give her credit for growth rather than punish her indefinitely for past mistakes. We still had work to do, conversations that needed having about inheritance and expectations and the casual cruelty of treating parents like obstacles to overcome. But we were talking now, actually communicating instead of performing relationship, and that was progress, even if it was slower than either of us wanted. The financial advisor I'd hired to manage my investments turned out to be worth every penny of his fee, as my portfolio grew steadily, even through market fluctuations that would have terrified me if I'd been managing it alone. "You're in good shape," he assured me during our quarterly review. "At this rate, you'll have enough to live comfortably for another 30 years, even if you never earn another dollar. 30 years would put me at 100. An age I couldn't imagine reaching, but also couldn't entirely dismiss, given that my mother had made it to 94. The thought of 3 more decades of life, lived on my own terms without waiting for permission or death, felt simultaneously daunting and exhilarating. I'd spent so much of my life in caretaker roles, daughter, wife, mother, that simply being Patricia, autonomous and answerable only to myself, required adjustment I was still working through. The apartment felt less temporary now, more like home, especially after I'd painted the second bedroom a deep blue that Richard would have chosen and set it up as combination office and craft room. I had space here, not the physical space of the old house, but the mental and emotional space to figure out who I was at 70 without the weight of other people's expectations. Jessica commented on it during one visit. "You seem different, Mom. Lighter somehow." I'd sold my house at a loss and gained myself at a profit, though that was too philosophical to explain over coffee and grocery store cookies. The story I'd been telling myself about family and inheritance and what parents owed their children underwent significant revision in the months following the sale, as I read books on elder financial abuse and talked to other women in my building who'd faced similar conflicts with adult children who'd mistaken potential inheritance for current ownership. Mrs. Chen introduced me to her bridge group, 7 women between 68 and 82, who met weekly and shared stories that ranged from hilarious to heartbreaking. 2 of them had been pressured into signing power of attorney documents they didn't fully understand. One had discovered her son refinancing her house without permission. Another had watched her daughter systematically clean out her jewelry collection, one piece at a time, always with excuses about keeping it safe or getting it appraised. These women's stories made my situation with Jessica feel almost mild by comparison, but they also validated my anger and my response. "You did the right thing," they assured me. "Property is power, and you kept your power." I'd never thought about it in those terms before, but they were right. Selling the house hadn't been about money. It had been about refusing to be treated as an inconvenient obstacle between my daughter and what she believed she was owed. Some lessons could only be taught through consequences, and Jessica had learned hers at the cost of $830,000 she'd assumed would someday be hers. Whether that lesson stuck remained to be seen, but at least I'd made my position clear. I was still here, still competent, still making my own choices about my own life. No one got to plan my funeral while I ate birthday cake. The approaching second anniversary of my 70th birthday found me in better health and spirits than I'd enjoyed in years, as if selling the house had somehow lifted a physical weight along with the emotional burden. My doctor commented on it during my annual checkup. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Your blood pressure is better, stress markers are down, you're sleeping well." I didn't tell him that what I was doing was living without the constant low-level anxiety of knowing my daughter was waiting for me to die. That seemed too dark for a medical appointment. Instead, I credited the watercolor classes and the book club and the weekly bridge games, all of which were true but incomplete explanations. Jessica called to ask what I wanted to do for my 72nd birthday, and I realized with surprise that I wanted to celebrate rather than dread another candle on a cake. "Something small," I told her. "Just you and me, maybe dinner somewhere nice." She suggested the Italian place downtown that Richard had loved, and I agreed, even though eating there without him would hurt in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Some hurt was worth carrying if it kept memory alive. We made a reservation for 7 p.m. on October 15th, my birthday, and I bought a new dress for the occasion because I was 72 and still allowed to care about how I looked. Jessica picked me up at the apartment, and I noticed she'd brought flowers. Daisies, my favorite, not roses, which she'd always preferred. Small gesture, but it registered. "Happy birthday, Mom," she said, and hugged me with the kind of tightness that suggested she was still working through her own regrets about the previous birthday party. "You look beautiful." Dinner was surprisingly easy, conversation flowing without the awkward pauses that had characterized our interactions for months after the sale. Jessica asked about my watercolors, and I showed her photos of my latest disaster, an attempt at a sunset that looked more like a bruise. She laughed and shared stories about her own work struggles, money problems that weren't quite critical but weren't comfortable either, and I listened without offering to solve everything with my checkbook. We were learning new patterns, and part of that meant letting her figure out her own problems instead of assuming my role was to rescue. Over tiramisu that we split because neither of us could finish a whole piece, Jessica said something that shifted the entire tone of the evening. "Mom, I need to tell you something. I've been in therapy since last year, working through why I did what I did at your birthday. Why I brought Mark, why I was so focused on the house, why I treated you like you were already gone." She paused, fork hovering over dessert. "My therapist helped me realize I was grieving Dad's death by trying to control yours. Like if I could plan everything perfectly, manage your estate efficiently, I could somehow avoid the pain of losing you the way I lost him. It doesn't excuse what I did, but it explains it." I sat with that information, turning it over in my mind like a stone examined for hidden facets. Richard's death had shattered both of us in different ways, and I'd been so focused on my own grief that I hadn't fully considered how Jessica processed hers. "Thank you for telling me," I finally said. "I'm glad you're getting help. I should probably talk to someone too." We finished dessert in companionable silence, and when the bill came, Jessica reached for it before I could. "My treat," she insisted. "You've bought me enough dinners over 72 years. I let her pay, another small adjustment in our evolving dynamic, and left feeling something approaching peace. The symbolic resolution of the house saga came unexpectedly several weeks after my birthday dinner, when I received an invitation to Mark and Elena's housewarming party. "Celebrating 1 year in our home," the card read, with my old address printed in elegant script below their names. Jessica had received an invitation too, she told me over the phone, her voice uncertain about whether attending would be masochistic or healing. "I think we should go," I told her, surprising myself with the conviction behind the words. "It's just a house, Jessica. It was our home once and now it's theirs, and that's okay." She agreed hesitantly, and we arrived together on a Saturday afternoon when fall leaves covered the lawn and the Japanese maple Mark and Elena had planted blazed red and gold near the front steps. The house looked the same but different, familiar architecture now holding strangers' furniture and memories. Elena greeted us warmly, showing us the kitchen renovations and the preserved tool wall in what was no longer Richard's workshop. Other guests circulated through rooms I'd once known intimately, and I felt oddly detached, like viewing a photograph of somewhere I'd once lived rather than standing in actual physical space that had contained my life. Jessica was quieter than usual, and I saw her touching door frames and looking at ceiling corners with an expression that might have been grief or acceptance, or some combination of both. Mark found us in the living room, offered wine, and thanked me again for selling them such a wonderful house at such a fair price. He had no idea that $830,000 had been $50,000 under market value, that my fairness had been calculated revenge dressed as generosity. I smiled and accepted the wine and felt nothing but relief that this house belonged to someone else now, that its future was their problem and their joy rather than my daughter's obsessive inheritance plan. The party conversation inevitably turned to real estate. This was, after all, a gathering of homeowners in a neighborhood where property values were the primary bonding mechanism, and I found myself telling the story of the sale in carefully edited terms that made it sound like practical downsizing rather than maternal revenge. Jessica stood beside me during the telling, adding details I'd forgotten about the moving process, and together we constructed a narrative that was true enough without being devastatingly honest. An older couple, the Hendersons from 2 doors down who'd known Richard, pulled me aside later to say they'd been sorry to see me go, but understood that maintaining a house at my age was challenging. I accepted their condolences for a difficulty I hadn't actually experienced, since Richard had kept everything in perfect working order and I'd had a lawn service for the yard. But I understood they needed to make sense of my departure in terms they found acceptable. The truth that I'd sold at a loss to prevent my daughter from treating my death as a real estate opportunity wasn't something they could process over wine and cheese cubes. Jessica and I stayed for exactly 90 minutes, long enough to be polite, but not so long that the afternoon turned painful, and walked back to her car in silence that felt contemplative rather than uncomfortable. "Are you okay?" she finally asked, and I realized I genuinely was. "I'm okay," I confirmed. "That's someone else's house now, someone else's maintenance and memories and mortgage. I'm free of it, and that feels good." Jessica nodded slowly, processing her own feelings in whatever internal landscape she inhabited. "I'm free of it too," she said quietly. Finally, the financial legacy of the sale continued to unfold in practical ways that Richard would have appreciated for their sensible planning and strategic thinking. I'd set up the scholarship fund in his name, with an endowment large enough to support 2 students per year in the community college's woodworking program, each recipient getting $5,000 for tuition, tools, and materials. The first awards were announced in the spring, going to a 19-year-old woman named Carmen, who wanted to restore vintage furniture, and a 62-year-old man named James, who'd been laid off from manufacturing and was retraining for a second career. The program director sent me photos of Carmen and James in the workshop, and I cried looking at them because Richard would have loved teaching both of them, would have appreciated Carmen's eye for detail and James's methodical problem-solving approach. Jessica came with me to the scholarship award ceremony, sat beside me while the dean spoke about Richard's legacy and the importance of supporting skilled trades, and squeezed my hand when Carmen mentioned that she'd never thought college was possible until this scholarship made it real. "Dad would be so proud," Jessica whispered, and I nodded because speech was impossible through the tightness in my throat. The scholarship felt like the proper use of the house money, a way to honor Richard's passion for teaching craftsmanship while creating opportunities for people who might not otherwise get them. Jessica had inherited furniture and photo albums and my mother's china cabinet, but Carmen and James and the dozens of students who'd follow them over the years, they'd inherited something more valuable. Richard's belief that working with your hands was honorable and that skill was worth cultivating, regardless of age or background. That was the legacy I wanted to leave, not a remodeled house or an estate split according to legal formulas, but the knowledge that how you used your resources mattered more than how much you accumulated. The watercolor painting I'd done of the old house, the terrible muddy mess that Jessica had bought for $50, underwent an unexpected transformation when she had it professionally framed and matted. She brought it to my apartment one Sunday afternoon, the painting now elevated by cream matting and a simple wooden frame that somehow made my incompetent brushwork look intentional. "I wanted you to see it properly displayed," she said, propping it against my bookshelf. "It's not bad, Mom. It's actually kind of beautiful in its imperfection." I squinted at my own work, trying to see what she saw, and maybe there was something honest in the way I'd captured the house's bones, if not its actual appearance. "You can keep it," I told her. "It's yours. You paid for it." But Jessica shook her head. "No, I want you to have it here, where you can see it every day. A reminder that home isn't about buildings or property values or who inherits what. It's about the memories we make and the love we put into things, even when those things are imperfect." She'd clearly been working hard in therapy, developing insights that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago when she was bringing realtors to my birthday party. I hung the painting in my bedroom where I could see it from my bed and found comfort in its existence. Proof that something beautiful could emerge from letting go, from accepting loss, from painting your own version of history instead of trying to preserve someone else's. The house in the painting didn't look like the actual house, but it looked like my memory of the house, which was more real to me than any photograph. Jessica visited more regularly now, our relationship rebuilt on honesty rather than obligation. And sometimes we painted together in my craft room, creating terrible watercolors side by side while talking about everything except what we'd lost and found in the process of selling a house that was never really the point at all. The ultimate accounting of my decision to sell at $50,000 under market value proved impossible to calculate in purely financial terms, because the benefits extended far beyond money into territories of autonomy, dignity, and self-determination that couldn't be measured in appraisals or closing statements. $814,000 in the bank meant security and comfort, but more importantly, it meant freedom from being treated as a countdown to inheritance, from watching my daughter mentally remodel my house while I was still living in it, from the slow erasure that happened when people decided you were already gone, even though you were standing right there. The scholarship fund would continue long after I was actually dead, supporting students who'd never know my name, but would benefit from the house Richard and I built together. Jessica had learned an expensive lesson about treating parents as people rather than obstacles, about the difference between inheritance and entitlement, about the way casual cruelty compounds over time until it necessitates dramatic response. We were still learning how to be mother and daughter in this new configuration, still figuring out what our relationship looked like when it wasn't built on assumptions about property transfer and estate planning. But we were learning, which was more than I'd thought possible on that birthday when she brought Mark to appraise my life. The apartment by the lake had become home in ways the old house never quite managed in its final years, because this space was entirely mine, chosen and paid for and decorated without considering anyone's opinion except my own. I'd traveled to 6 countries in 2 years, taken up painting despite having no talent, made friends who knew me as Patricia rather than Jessica's mother or Richard's widow, and discovered that life at 72 could still contain surprises and growth and change. The house was gone, sold to strangers who'd turned it into their own version of home, and I didn't miss it. What I'd miss when my time actually came was this: the daily choice to live fully, the freedom to be imperfect, and the hard-won knowledge that some things were worth losing if it meant keeping yourself. The second anniversary of the sale arrived during a week of unseasonably warm weather that felt like a gift, and I marked it privately by having coffee on my balcony while watching the sunrise paint the lake in shades of pink and gold that would have made my watercolor teacher proud. Jessica called mid-morning to check in, no longer feeling the need to have a reason for calling, which represented its own form of progress in our relationship. We talked about nothing important: her work project, my book club's current selection, the weather, and everything important in the subtext of simply choosing to stay connected. "Love you, Mom," she said before hanging up, and the words felt earned rather than obligatory, genuine rather than performative. I sat with my phone for a while after the call ended, thinking about all the ways life could surprise you, how selling a house could save a relationship, how loss could lead to finding things you didn't know you needed. Mark and Elena sent a card each year on the anniversary of closing, thanking me again for the house and including photos of their family in various rooms I used to inhabit. This year's photo showed their daughter reading in what had been Jessica's room, now painted yellow with the window seat they'd installed, and the girl looked happy and comfortable and entirely at home. Perfect. The house belonged to them now in ways that went beyond legal ownership, had absorbed their memories and routines until my time. There was just another layer in its ongoing history. That's what houses did, if you let them. They held your life for a while and then released you to make room for whoever came next, and the cycle continued until eventually the house itself would be demolished or renovated beyond recognition, and none of it would matter except to the people who'd loved it while it was theirs. I'd loved that house, and Richard had loved it, and Jessica had grown up there, and now Mark and Elena were making new memories in the same walls. The math worked out to everyone getting what they needed, even if the process had been painful and expensive and necessary in ways none of us had chosen. The final paragraphs of any story are where meaning supposedly crystallizes, where lessons are learned and growth is demonstrated, and the protagonist emerges changed by their journey. I'd sold my house to spite my daughter and found freedom instead. I'd taken $50,000 less than market value and gained something worth far more than money could measure. I'd let go of 4 decades of accumulated memories and discovered that memories didn't require physical locations to remain valid and real. Jessica had learned that inheritance wasn't guaranteed, and that treating your living parent as an inconvenient delay before remodeling was a fast way to lose both the inheritance and the parent. Mark and Elena had gotten a beautiful house at a discount and probably had no idea about the family drama that had made their purchase possible. Everyone had won something. Everyone had lost something, and the balance felt appropriate, even when it didn't feel fair. If I'd known at 70 that I'd sell my house at 72 and feel nothing but relief, I would have done it years earlier and saved myself the anxiety of watching Jessica measure doorways and discuss future renovations while I was still living there. But maybe the timing had been perfect. Maybe I'd needed those 2 years of growing discomfort to build the courage necessary to make such a dramatic change. Richard used to say that you couldn't rush decisions that required you to grieve what you were giving up. And selling the house had required grieving the version of myself who'd believed keeping the house intact meant keeping our family intact. I'd been wrong about that, and being wrong had freed me to be right about other things, to make choices based on my own needs rather than other people's expectations. That was the gift hidden in my daughter's birthday betrayal, the unexpected grace that emerged from casual cruelty, the realization that I was still the author of my own story, still capable of plot twists, still alive in ways that mattered beyond simply continuing to breathe while other people made plans for my absence. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, through birthday cake and real estate closings and terrible watercolors and family reconciliation that looked different from forgiveness but worked anyway, thank you. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about 70-something women who refuse to be treated as obstacles to inheritance, who sell houses and travel to Europe and take up painting despite having no talent, who learn that life doesn't end at 70 or 80 or 90, but simply changes shape into something that might be smaller in physical space but larger in emotional territory. Comment with your city or state below. I'd love to know where you're watching from, and whether you've ever had to reclaim your life from people who'd already planned your exit. The comments section has become a community of people sharing their own stories of adult children who confused potential inheritance with current entitlement, of parents who had to choose between maintaining peace and maintaining autonomy, of families who rebuilt on honest foundations after the pretty facades cracked and collapsed. My story isn't unique, which is both comforting and devastating. But maybe sharing it helps someone else recognize the warning signs before their daughter brings an appraiser to their birthday party. Or maybe it just helps people feel less alone in the specific loneliness of being elderly in a culture that values you primarily for what you'll eventually leave behind. Either way, I'm here, at 74 now, still living in my apartment by the lake, still taking watercolor classes where I create beautiful disasters, still talking to Jessica weekly, and slowly building something that looks like the relationship we should have had all along. The house is long sold, the money is wisely invested, the scholarship continues in Richard's name, and I continue in my own name, which turns out to be enough.